Okay, so today, like I said, we're going to go ahead and pick up with Unit 8. Unit 8 is all about um, abnormal behavior. In your textbook, it's called abnormal behavior. And then the corresponding unit is called treatment of abnormal behaviors. Is this okay if I do lights off? Y'all going to fall asleep? Does anybody out there not have Unit 8 or 9? Anybody? Everybody's got Unit 8 ready to go? Okay. You should have a digital copy available as well, just in case you lose your hard copy. Hard copy is probably the best for taking fast notes and making little comments. Um, so I do find that this unit is one of the more popular units. We're going to cover quite a bit of material today. But again, when we talk about abnormal behaviors, um, sometimes referred to as mental disorder, there are thousands of specific diagnoses that can be found in the DSM-5. We're going to talk about the DSM-5 today. Again, if you ever have questions about a particular disorder, most likely, if it is an actual disorder, it will most likely be in this book. If it's not in this book, most likely it's not a defined mental disorder, or maybe it's been renamed something else. Okay, before we get started, I do want to thank everybody that showed up for our practice test. We did have about 10 no-shows, but ultimately we ended up having about 20, 21 AP Psych students. So I appreciate you guys that showed up. Does anybody have any questions about anything up to this point? I checked out your Jamboard this morning. I still have 0 topics for review. Guys, over the next 2 days, I really would like you to go back through the textbook when you have time, or go back through your notes. Start throwing topics up there. We don't have a whole lot of time to do the review, but I will try to chip away at any questions that you guys have. I'll try to give you a full definition or explanation of whatever term, topic, whatever you put up there. Okay, so just take some time. I think a lot of you are discovering that this is a very, very vocab heavy course. And if you haven't started going back, like I've been suggesting over the last few months, to study your vocab, you really, really, really need to get into that mode now, like today, because we don't have a lot of time left. So does anybody have any questions on testing procedures, day of the test? I haven't heard anything about you guys having to come in to school for the first part unless you have some sort of an exam. You are able to come in if you choose. If you choose, you can come in the morning. But again, if you come in to, maybe take a test in the morning or something, like maybe you have a class or a project or something, if that's something you have to do, you'll have to go to all your classes. And then probably around 11:30, 11:45, they'll call you down to go to the RMMT for the test. Okay. Everybody else you guys should grab something to eat, maybe not a whole bunch, so you're going to pass out tired during the test, but you should grab a small lunch. And again, I will have some snacks for you. Tro, question? Whenever your grades are due, your grades hope are going to be due a little earlier. So, I mean, it's just something you should chip away at. You'll have, once we're done with the exam Tuesday, you guys, I'm probably going to have Thursday as a free day. We'll talk about your upcoming exam project, but we won't actually get to that exam project until the following week, except for Hope and I will have a conversation to make sure Hope knows what's going on. That way you have enough time to do what you need to do if necessary. But those those knowledge checks are not due, finalized, until your last day, plus or minus maybe a few days, Tro, end of the quarter. I may ask you to have them in a little bit earlier, just because I'm actually going to I won't be here the last week of school because I'm doing my reading for the College Board. So, pardon me? So what will happen, usually the first couple days of the test, it takes them a couple days to figure this out. What's going to happen is they'll probably mark you as absent, and then Miss Fields, who keeps attendance of all the people that attend, she'll go back in retroactively and change it to it'll be SC testing, on-site testing, or something like that. Kind of like when you have like the SAT, pre-SAT, that sort of a thing. It'll show up eventually like that. Just keep an eye on your attendance. If you go to the exam, it's nothing to worry about. It will get fixed. If you don't go to the exam and you're not in school, then you're going to have it unexcused, and it'll be counted as an unexcused. There was another question over here. Aiden, was that you? Nothing. Nothing. No, you should be SC on-site testing all day excused. Oh, you're talking about a non-AP exam in the morning. So my understanding is this: if you so our exam is in the afternoon. Say you have a test first block or whatever. It would be this block because it's a B day. But anyway, say it's an A day and you have a test first block. If you go to take that test, you need to either sign out and you'll have to take the absences because you showed up, or you just don't show and get SC on site. Now, I've seen it where it's happened that they've just recorded you as SC on site regardless. Sometimes there's a little bit of irregularity. I mean, no, but I would not suggest you skip. I would make sure you just get a note to sign out if you're going to do that. Like if you have to take a test first thing, a non-AP test, and you're going to take a period or two off, then come back, I would sign out and sign back in. You just have a parent fill out a note or something like that, just to dot your I's and cross your T's. Any other questions? All right. So, guys, again, if I go too fast, please let me know. If you have questions, there's a lot of interesting stuff in here. Guys, I can't cover all 2,000 or 3,000 different mental diagnoses, but I am happy to try to answer your questions. Also, you will get the chance, if you so choose, to deep dive into a mental illness for a potential final exam project idea. So if there's something in here that you're really interested in and we don't get a chance to really get into it, you're more than welcome to select that for your final project. And I'll explain all that later. Okay, all right, let's go ahead and dive in. The first thing we're going to talk about is the history, which is actually kind of scary, the history of the treatment of mental disorders. And one of the bad things is that for much of human history, the way mental illness was treated was pretty alarming. So one thing we need to do here, highlight how we define psychological disorders, and I would suggest you underline, it must be clinically significant disturbance in one's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior. Now, this is actually from the DSM-5. And a couple other terms, just so you guys are aware, dysfunction and maladaptive behaviors are the same thing. Well, they're very close to the same thing. Any type of psychological, emotional, or behavioral dysfunction or maladaptive behavior simply results in interference with daily functioning. This can be slight or it can be severe. It can be periodic, but it must be to some degree chronic or long lasting. And when I say long lasting, there's a lot of variation what technically means long lasting. It doesn't necessarily, it could be a mental disorder that maybe shows up once every couple months, but it lasts an entire lifetime. Maybe not super frequent, but it does show up, it does appear. There are a few disorders that have kind of a sporadic appearance rate. There are other disorders that you can see every single day that never really go away. There are disorders that have periods of what I like to call on and off. Okay, sometimes they're very, very apparent. Other times you can't see them at all. Okay. Okay, so let's look at the history, guys. And again, unfortunately, a lot of the history is really, really sad when it comes to the treatment of mental illness. Guys, we don't see adequate treatment of folks that have mental disorders until we get to pretty much the 1980s, 1990s. Now, things do get better, and then it starts with the medical model. Philippe Pinel, I would, highlight that. Philippe Pinel in the late 19th century, late 1800s, early 1900s, we see Philippe Pinel, who was a French physician, really start to approach mental illness as a disease. It's a really important thing for you to understand. Mental illness as a disease is much different than how it was viewed previous to this. Previous to this, it was demonic possession, it was evil spirits. And the guys, we're talking mid to late 1800s, all the way back to the beginning of human history. Hundreds of thousands of years of thinking this. In fact, one of the earliest methods of treatment of mental disorders was trepanning. Trepanning is basically, and I may have mentioned this to you already, but basically drilling a hole in the head with a rudimentary drill, go through the skull, cut into the brain. And the whole point was to do what? Well, you got to give a hole to let the evil spirits come out of the brain, right? I mean, duh, everybody knows that. All right, that's why trepanning was one of the first treatments. We actually see evidence of trepanning in the 3rd and 4th millennia BCE. Okay, so 4 and 5,000 years ago, is some of the first evidence of trepanning, where they actually have stone drills that they would rub back and forth to drill into a person's head. We see skulls that have the holes that have been surgically, not real well, but they've been surgically had holes cut into them. Okay, today, today we now obviously all psychology and pretty much anybody in any mental health field views mental illness as a very real thing. There's much more awareness today. Not that we don't have room to improve. There's always room to improve. But the treatment of mental disorders has drastically gotten better in the last 50 years. One of the things is that biopsychosocial approach is the understanding that we have psychological factors, biological factors, and social cultural factors. And all of those work together in varying degrees to create more severe or less severe impacts and or treatments for these mental disorders. All right, guys, the DSM-5. This is the psychiatrist slash psychologist Bible. All right, this is an actual copy of it. Now, this is kind of a chopped down version. It's a smaller version. The real DSM-5. This is a real DSM-5. It's just a small version. They're usually a little bit bigger, kind of like an encyclopedia size. But this not only identifies all of the known mental disorders in the world, as far as we know, it also provides a very in-depth list of symptoms. So if I have a particular disorder, take MDD, major depressive disorder, that's going to be outlined in this book. Okay, again, we're talking thousands of disorders. The DSM-5 is a living document, which means it is constantly being updated. Now, it does say DSM-5. That means we're in the 5th printing or the 5th edition of this work. The 4th edition was common in the 1950s. I don't know the exact years, but post-World War II, we were in the DSM-4. And again, I bring this up. The DSM-4, which was a highly regarded medical document, treated homosexuality as a disease, a mental illness that could be cured. That was one printing ago, guys. And the reason I say that is I wanted to show you how ideology and documentation can change. Interpretation can change. Autism. Okay, we used to have low functioning autistic folks, according to this, in earlier prints. High functioning would have been considered Asperger's syndrome. Today, we do not necessarily refer to Asperger's and low functioning as actual diagnoses. We call the diagnosis autism spectrum disorder. Verbiage changes, interpretation changes. And a couple things that we need to keep in mind when it comes to labeling, we have to be careful because when they write this book, a lot of times people attach negative stereotypes to terms and illnesses. Mentally retarded. Okay, we've all heard that. You're retarded. Okay, you're so retarded. Retarded is technically a word that means slow. Everything okay? What's going on? Is it shorting out or what's going on?
No, I was just trying to charge my Chromebook and I
Okay.
turned that thing.
Well, it
No,
still
it
should
works
work.
now. Yeah.
We could leave the fan on too.
Oh, well, it wasn't on like before I just turned it on a second
Is
ago.
it charging?
No.
Well, it needs to be
Not
on.
yet.
That's why.
Well, yeah.
Are we good?
Yeah.
All right. All right. Here we go. Success. Okay. So terminology changes. Okay. Things are adapted and changed to make things more politically correct. Because of the strong connotation with being considered or labeled mentally retarded, that was a term that was used like by professionals when I was a kid, mentally retarded. But because there's such a strong connotation today, they've changed the verbiage to cognitively delayed. It's more politically correct, and there's less of a stigma surrounding that labeling. Stigmas are very powerful things, and terminology has to be changed to adapt to those stigmas. You guys understand what a stigma is, right? It's the negative connotation attached to the term mentally retarded. Any questions? Okay, clients, subjects, and patients. What's the difference? If you ever get into clinical psychology, the people that you will see will be your clients most of the time. Clients are specifically, the term clients is meant to kind of reinforce the relationship between the therapist and the person seeking treatment. Subjects, we see this more in the research side of psychology. The term subject, and I would highlight all three of these, the term subject means there's a separation between the researcher and the person being examined. Okay, and that is to eliminate what B word? Bias. Good, because a quality research study needs to eliminate bias or try to reduce bias as much as possible. Patience is more reserved for the medical field. However, you may see psychiatrists and or some psychologists refer to their clients as patients as well. Patience is more connected ideology with people seeking medical treatment. Okay, now not all mental disorder has to or can be treated through the use of medicine. Sometimes it's only treatable through therapies, non-medicinal therapies. Questions on this? All right, I forgot to mention this, guys. There are some critiques of the DSM. A lot of people say it's too rigid in its detailing, and it doesn't allow for cases that challenge some of those details by having so many details like, MDD, major depressive disorder, is X, Y, and Z, and A, and B, and C. Anything that falls outside of that has to fall somewhere else, okay? So by having so many details, there's less flexibility, and it doesn't really allow for therapist or medicinal interpretations. All right, questions on that? How many of you guys find this stuff interesting? The mental disorder side of this? Well, we're about to get into some of the actual mental disorders. We'll get into the prevalence. Prevalence, again, just means how widespread something is. Prevalence of psychological disorders. I have a list and a chart of those disorders. Jay, you getting all this? Good. General risk factors and preventative factors. Again, this is more of the treatment part. We'll get into the treatment part in the second half of this. Highlight this word, resilience. The ability to cope with either mental or emotional crises. How many of you would consider yourself fairly resilient people? Kids your age usually are fairly resilient. Now, you may not know that because you haven't had a whole lot of severe trauma, and that's good. I hope you don't. But one of the studies that was looked at in terms of resilience was the Holocaust. Okay, obviously we know about the Holocaust. The people that actually survived the Holocaust, that were interned at some of the either work camps or prison camps, extermination camps, people that lived through those experiences demonstrated after the Holocaust incredibly high levels of resilience, meaning that they were able to live through that harrowing experience. It actually makes them stronger and more able to adapt and cope with crisis later in the future. Okay, so again, Some folks obviously didn't. A lot of folks never made it out, but those that did were more well equipped to handle crisis because of those severe situations that they were confronted with during the Holocaust. All right, why do people seek out therapy? Well, um, usually people are they feel that something is wrong, and they usually actively try to seek out people to help them if they're in a state of crisis. Okay. Um, when you enter into therapy, usually you want help. You need help. You say, "I need help." You don't just go to the doctor unless it's a routine checkup. You don't just go to the doctor and say, "Oh, I haven't seen my doctor in a while. I want to pay $150 to go see my doctor today." Okay, we go to the doctor for a reason. Even if it's a preventative reason, we go for a reason. And people that seek out mental help or mental professionals or therapy, they enter into therapy in a state of crisis. Now, sometimes those crises can actually just naturally end. For example, if you're having a really hard time with the loss of a loved one, which oftentimes people will have that, um, time will help soothe some of that. It doesn't make the pain go away, but time is part of the natural healing process. So as time elapses, people begin to heal and cope and process that loss. Okay, so it may not actually be the therapy in some cases. Therapy is always helpful, at least it should be if you have a good therapist. But sometimes it does, it is the time that actually a crisis needs to pass. Um, Clients oftentimes want to feel justified. When you go to see a mental health care professional, guys, you're probably talking, now insurance covers a lot of this in some cases depending on your insurance, but you're talking usually hundreds of dollars an hour for therapy sessions. Okay, whether you're paying it or insurance is paying it, but it's a lot of time. You have to take time out of your schedule. You have to make an appointment. You have to drive there. You have to meet with your therapist for a half hour, whatever it might be, and then you get to pay the bills after. Okay, all of that is a cost to you. So when people go to see a therapist, oftentimes they want to feel like what they're doing is resulting in a positive effect for them. It may or may not be, but they want to feel that. They're incentivized to believe that their therapy is helping because of the cost to them. Um, Regardless of the quality of the therapist, most clients, not all, but most clients view their therapist as somebody that wants to help them. I mean, obviously, most therapists, not all, but most therapists get involved in the field like teachers. You know, we're here to help students. Therapists want to help people in need. But it doesn't necessarily always mean that their therapies that they're applying to their client are 100% effective. Does that make sense? We're just looking at how sometimes treatments can be skewed by how people seeking out mental help can go into the situation. All right, here are a couple treatments that we see for various different disorders, and I want you guys just to take a quick look at this. Eye movement desensitization, or EDMR. So the psychology world is getting more and more data, as well as other medical fields like psychiatry. More and more data is coming forward that's showing that EMDR is actually a fairly effective process for some. And basically what this is you go through a series of flashes and eye movement desensitization, and it's used to help treat people with PTSD. Again, there may be a strong placebo effect in play here. People that have PTSD and suffer the effects of PTSD may want to just get better, and by undergoing any treatment, they may see a positive outcome. In this case, there are still some people in the field that says the data is not enough to create a correlation, so they call it a pseudo-psychological practice. Okay, there are some pseudo-psychological practices out there that are becoming either more or less proven by data. Another one is the use of hallucinogenics in the treatment of PTSD. PTSD is just a major field right now. It's receiving a lot of research. Not that other areas of mental disorders are not, but light exposure therapy. How many of you come from up north? Okay, seasonal affective disorder. is a thing for some people. Okay, when you only see the sunshine so often, you can actually offset in some cases by providing UVA, UVB, or like kind of like a tanning booth. You can actually offset this seasonal affective disorder sometimes in certain people with providing light exposure therapy. Okay, any questions on those two? Those are just two little quick treatments that are still kind of they're kind of making their way through more cutting edge psychology, but we are starting to see positive effects, at least in some people. Okay, meta-analysis. Meta-analysis, this is an important concept. If I'm conducting a study in schizophrenia, okay, in order for me to have the richest understanding of what it is I'm looking at, I would probably do a meta-analysis of data. What that means is I look at as many high quality studies that have already been done on schizophrenia, and then I compile that data into a central database. Okay, if that data was collected using proper research techniques, if it was fairly current data, okay, I would collect as much as I could, and I would create a centralized database that takes into account multiple different data sources. So it's just a bunch of data sources pushed into one singular database. Yes, Liv. Here, you can butcher this up as much as you need. Great. Who else does not have that page? This page, seasonal. Get your hands up. Come on. Let me just deal with it. Not everybody. Okay, that's good. All right. Keep those hands up. This whole row, 1, 2, 3, 4. New booklets. Double check to make sure you have the pages that you need. You can tear them apart, put the staple pages in, however you need. Anybody else? Anybody else? Okay, Isabella. Sorry about that, guys. The copy machine's a little wonky, so. All right. Evidence-based practice is a method that psychologists should use. Highlight it, make sure you know the definition. Basically, you're going off of the most current data, the most current best practice. Okay, treating of mental illness, we would not go back and treat somebody with trepanning or drilling a hole in their head to let the evil spirits out. That is not an evidence-based practice. That's a practice that was based off of superstition, religion, and incorrect belief. Today, we would use drug therapy, group therapy, something that's proven. Yes. Yes, the lobotomy was a way in the 1950s, especially. One doctor in particular, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but one doctor in particular here in the United States claimed that he perfected the lobotomy, and I think I have it in here, but basically what it is, his method was called the transorbital frontal lobe lobotomy. And if you've ever seen the movie Sucker Punch, she gets a lobotomy at the end. I know it's an older movie now. Nurse Ratched, the miniseries with Sarah Paulson, also lots of lobotomies. Basically what they do is they take an ice pick, in essence, pull your eyelid up, shove the ice pick in between the top of your eye and underneath your eyelid, and they take a hammer and they just jam it in there at a particular degree. And what they do is they drive it into the upper part of your orbital bone, and then they crack the orbital bone. So they take the ice pick, crack it down a little bit, then they take a hammer, tap, 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 drive it into a certain length, tip it up, and then tap. They punch into your frontal lobe, going kind of like on the back side of your frontal orbital bone. Your orbital bone is where your eyebrows are at. Okay? They go underneath that, and then they just take it and they scramble your frontal lobe. It's kind of like using a hand grenade to try to cut out a little figurine of paper. Like it's overkill, and a lot of people either died or became basically vegetables because of it. John F. Kennedy's cousin, Rosalind Kennedy, is one of the good examples of a person that ends up having serious side effects. I think she ends up dying a few years after her lobotomy. It has, for people that are extreme emotional or behavioral emotionally or behaviorally disturbed, it can calm them. The problem is that when you are wiggling around that ice pick, like it's very easy to go into areas of the brain that are crucial for mood and other things. But the whole point is that if you destroy the frontal lobe where you have mood, especially aggression, like elements of aggression, control, and you scramble that up, you just kind of erase it. And a lot of times it'll just turn the person into like almost a zombie if they don't die in the process. But the lobotomy, again, was highly pseudo psychological. It was a pseudo medical practice. They're highly illegal today. You can't do a lobotomy. Besides, we have better technology today. You can actually go in and use a laser to lesion the specific parts of the brain you don't want or need or that are causing issues. It's not like throwing a hand grenade at it now. It's like, oh, I hope I get lucky and hit the right thing. It's not like that anymore. And the science realized that fairly quickly. By the 1970s, zero lobotomies. I think it was outlawed by the 1970s. So at least in the United States. I don't know about other countries. All right, guys. So we're gonna hop into anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders. This is a very large category, almost 200 specific different diagnoses. I can't go through all 200. But at the root of every single one of these diagnoses in this category is anxiousness. Okay? We're going to touch on a few of them. Okay? I want you to highlight anxiety disorders, and I want you to highlight, again, to be considered a disorder, it must persistently interfere with everyday life. It's really important that you understand that. Persistent just means it's happening enough to disrupt life. If it happens once every 10 years, it's not a persistent disruption. Or even like once or twice a year is probably not a persistent disruption. Okay. Panic disorders and GAD. GAD is an anxiety disorder that is being more and more diagnosed every day. General anxiety disorder. This is usually ongoing anxiety that can be triggered by, in some cases, specific things, but oftentimes it can really be any kind of a trigger that triggers an anxious reaction. And then that anxiousness just kind of builds on itself and can kind of fall into almost a borderline panic attack for some or a full-blown panic attack for some, hyperventilating, inability to focus on anything else, elevated. It's basically the initiation of a fight or flight reaction. Okay, maybe not to full extension, but it is basically the beginning of a fight or flight reaction. Panic disorders, guys. This is where we have our phobias. If you have an intense fear of something, it is. Is everything good? The fan too cold? Okay. All right. Agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is basically fear of going out into public places or openness. And there are people that oftentimes will end up becoming recluses or people that recluse themselves or pull themselves away from society out of fear of interacting with other people. Phobia, again, like I said, what's the difference between fear and phobia? A phobia has a compelling component, meaning that it prompts us to do behaviors that oftentimes can be abnormal, either slightly abnormal or very abnormal. Like if I have an intense phobia of snakes, I may avoid any area that I have ever seen a snake, any grassy areas. I may avoid going into the woods ever. Okay. If my phobia is strong enough, I'll probably have a resulting behavior of avoidance somewhere that's usually highly compelling and slightly odd. Obsessive compulsive disorder. There are two parts. There's an obsession and a compulsion. That's why it's called OCD, or obsessive compulsive behaviors. So obsessive thoughts. One of the things that a lot of people that suffer from obsessive compulsive disorder suffer from is like little behavioral tics, not movements like tics, but tics as in things that they have to do when they are going out there, going through their everyday lives. Do you guys remember the little thing that you used to do? Step on a crack, break your mama's back, like when you avoided cracks in the sidewalk. Now, don't do that in downtown Charleston because you'll break your mama's back 1,000 times. But If you ever tried to avoid the cracks, that's one of the things that oftentimes some obsessive compulsive people will obsess over. They have an obsessive thought, okay? And that thought would be, I can never step on a crack. If you've ever watched As Good as It Gets with Jack Nicholson, he actually is suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder, and he has a tic. Another one of his tics is every time he goes into his home, he comes into the door, locks the door, and he's got a deadbolt, and he has to click his deadbolt. He has to operate fully the deadbolt 3 times. 1, and he counts it out. 2, 3, and then he closes it and locks it. If he doesn't do that, it results in a phobia or a phobic type reaction. Okay, every time he washes his hands, okay, he turns it on scalding hot water and grabs a brand new bar of Neutrogena soap, unwraps it, throws the wrapper in the trash, washes his hand under scalding water, and then throws the entire bar of soap away. Okay, again, that is a behavior that is obsessive and compulsive. Okay, the obsession is the thought, the compulsion is the behavior that satisfies that thought. Please write that down or make a note of that, all right? The obsession is the thought, the compulsion is the behavior that alleviates that thought. Okay? In that movie, there's a scene of him trying to get to his therapist, and he lives in New York City. So he's walking distance to his therapist. But you can see him, one of the struggles that he has is getting from his apartment to his therapist's office on the sidewalk because there's tons of cracks and it's New York City. So there's thousands of people all the time everywhere. So he's trying to like jump around and like dodge people and like hopping and trying to avoid stepping on a crack. All right, that's a type of a behavior that somebody that suffers from obsessive compulsive disorder would suffer from. Okay, post-traumatic stress disorder. This is it's not a new field of psychology, but it is receiving more and more attention. In particular, why? From what career field? Military and first responders. Okay, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, PTSD is not something that only first responders and military personnel suffer from. PTSD can be suffered by somebody that's a rape victim, a mugging victim, somebody that has fallen out of a tree and broken every bone in their body. Any event that is viewed in the person's mind as traumatic enough can cause PTSD. All right. But one of the big pushes behind trying to learn more about PTSD is the high rate of suicides attached to our military personnel. How many military personnel commit suicide every day? On average. Active service men and women or veteran, retired. 22 a day. 22 commit suicide a day on average. Incredibly high rate. Okay? And a lot of that is due to, at least in part, some elements of PTSD. Okay? All right. So, again, proximity. This is an important part to PTSD. If y'all could highlight this, proximity to an event or a situation can actually increase your level of PTSD. Folks that were in the World Trade Center when it went down, okay, that actually survived or that had to go in after it had fallen, they were 2 times more likely to have more severe PTSD than folks outside of the building. Why? Because they were just closer to it. Now, again, this is a generalization. It doesn't necessarily mean every single person that went in suffered from PTSD, but they were more likely to suffer from PTSD. Does anybody have any questions on anxiety-based disorders? Do y'all understand the basic concept? Think fear, think anxiousness. Okay, that's the core of this category. Again, almost 200 specific disorders in that category. Okay, anxiety, OCD, PTSD. Those are the big 3 that we looked at. Obviously, the learning perspective. Basically, guys, what this is, it's a way to kind of look at the disorder. And the little Albert case study. When we look at this, little Albert shows us how fear can cause generalizations. Okay, again, the generalization with little Albert, that's something that you 100% need to know for your exam. Generalization is where little Albert not only feared that white rat, which is what he reached for every time they'd hit that bar, but he started to fear everything that was fuzzy and or white. Okay, even Santa Claus mask. All right. Maladaptive behaviors. Highlight that guy again. I think we've already talked about it, but again, maladaptive behaviors are behaviors that reinforce the traumatic experience or the compulsion. People that suffer from obsessive compulsive disorder, their compulsive behaviors actually reinforce their disorder. Does that make sense? Like if I'm Jack Nicholson's character, every time I walk through my door, every time I shut that door and I lock it, 1, 2, 3, okay? That behavior, that compulsion is actually reinforcing the obsessive compulsive disorder because I'm carrying the behavior out, okay? So again, those maladaptive behaviors, they just reinforce, they reinforce that behavior. Okay. Oftentimes, people that have anxiety also are hypervigilant and attentive. Hypervigilant means you're super aware. I would highlight. Okay. The biological part to this, when we see people with anxiety disorders, we often see elevated levels of serotonin and glutamate. I would underline that, circle that, and highlight. With anxiousness, we see elevated levels of serotonin and glutamate. Remember, glutamate is the body's major excitatory neurotransmitter, which makes sense. Serotonin balances our mood out. So as glutamate gets increased in terms of its strength, serotonin is also released to try to balance out the mood. And epigenetics is something we talked about in the last chapter, or maybe 2 chapters ago, 2 units ago. Epigenetics is basically scarring on our chromosomes due to traumatic events. It can be anything from teratogens to abuse to neglect, or in this case, traumatic events that can create scarring. Okay, and epigenetics is the study of not only the scarring of those characteristics, but also the long lastingness, and from one generation to the next generation. If you have a parent or a sibling that has some sort of anxiety disorder, you are more likely, percentage wise, to have that disorder. All right, moving on. Any questions? How do we treat anxiety disorders? 2 main ways. Now, this is not the only ways. And one of the things that you're going to see almost in every category will be counseling. Okay, group therapy, talk therapy, free association, all of these things can be used. Those are non-medical therapies. Some medications along with therapies, CBT. If you don't know what this means, this is cognitive behavioral therapy. We will get to it in the second half of this packet. CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy. We try to change the way we think, and we also try to change the behaviors responding to the mental disorder. Meditation, calming actions, okay? And then psychotherapy. These are the non-medicinal therapies. In terms of medicinals, SSRIs, Prozac is a very common anti-anxiety drug. Sedatives also, to some degree. In severe cases, they will prescribe barbiturates, sedatives, things to calm you down. But remember, those are more habit-forming, more opiate-based. Okay, any questions on OCD, PTSD, anxiety disorders? All right, second, probably one of the biggest categories of mental disorders would be mood disorders, which includes depressive disorders. Okay, major depressive disorder. This is chronic, ongoing depression. I would highlight this. Bipolar disorder. Why do they call it bipolar disorder? Okay, yeah, there's an up and there's a down. The upswing, and there's a lot of people that have this, guys. Johnny Depp is bipolar. Okay, you all know who Johnny Depp is. Obviously, Johnny Depp lives the Hollywood lifestyle, but a lot of artists, I think Samuel Clemens was even bipolar. A lot of times, artists, when they're experiencing what's called the manic phase or the mania phase of bipolar disorder, they're on a super focused upswing of emotion and almost a compulsive type behavior, but hyper focused, super energetic, very, very elevated mood. But just like Halloween candy, all right, what comes after? A severe crash. That's the depressive trough. Okay, mania, depressive trough. The depressive trough is where oftentimes bipolar patients will attempt either self harm or suicide, because the problem with bipolar is it's the mood swings. The mania followed by that deep depressive trough. Okay, as people enter into that deep depressive trough, they know that they were just up here, but now they're down here, okay, in a very dark place. This is oftentimes equatable to large or high levels of either attempted suicide or suicide, which is where we get into suicides and self-harm. Obviously, not a super pleasant topic to talk about, but oftentimes people will turn to suicide because they feel they have no other option. Okay, a lot of times people, especially people with mental disorders like this, they want to just end that cycle, end the positive followed by the massive depressive cycle. Okay, um, self-harm. Self-harm. This sounds very weird. These are people that practice like masochistic cutting. It can be like pinching, skin picking. Now, skin picking can also be other disorders, but self-harm is an attempt of these people to try to distract them from whatever is depressing them. If you're harming yourself, the attention is elsewhere and you're not focusing on the depression or whatever else has really got you down. Okay, I know that sounds kind of odd to us, but if you've ever had a depressive situation, anytime you can divert your attention to something else can make you feel at least slightly better. All right, now NSSI. Highlight that, please. NSSI. Non-suicidal self-injury. Non-suicidal self-injury is what the direct infliction of pain, usually, or some sort of bodily tissue destruction, not for social reasons. Okay, there are people that will damage bodily tissues for social reasons. There are people that will damage themselves for non-social reasons. This is again is a distractive attempt to try to divert whatever negative thoughts they may be having to something else. It's a very sad situation, but again, it's non-suicidal. There is suicidal, and then there's non-suicidal. Does anybody have any question on this? Highlight this. The depressed brain does show shrinkage, similar to alcoholism, similar to folks that have neurocognitive disorders. We do see some deactivation of depression or shrinkage of the brain during depressive states. What's one of the things that depression or elements of depression affects? Anybody, come on. Mood for sure, but more, just as important, sleep. And in order to have a fully formed brain that maintains its size over time, you have to have sleep. Depression oftentimes robs us of sleep. Okay? All right. Rumination. Another key term. Cows are referred to as ruminants. Why? Multiple stomachs, and the food is processed again and again and again and again. Grass and other, tough vegetative type materials take a long time to break down. Therefore, cattle and some other herbivores need to eat a lot of grass, but they also need 4 separate digestive stomachs, which means their food takes a long time. To ruminate on something means you dwell on it. Okay, you focus on it, and sometimes it can almost become an obsession. All right. Unfortunately, the depression cycle, again, when you're depressed, you lose energy, fatigue increases, you lose energy and interest. Okay. And again, this is the cycle of depression. People oftentimes who become depressed have increased levels of guilt. It's my fault. I'm the reason. There's something wrong with me. They do a lot of self blame. This is a very dangerous cycle that people that suffer from excessive and chronic depression can find themselves in. This is how either NSSI or suicide can occur. And again, there's other factors involved, sleep and stress. The less you sleep, the more stressed you are. The more stress you have, the more depressed you are. The more depressed you are, the less sleep you get, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is called the depression cycle, okay? And it can be a very quick downward spiral if you're not careful. Yes, sir. Well, so people that suffer from depression oftentimes will use sleep or rest as an excuse to, or not an excuse, that's probably not the right word, but a way to try to deal with the depression. And anxiousness does rob us of sleep also. But depression, people that suffer from chronic depression don't receive quality sleep at night, which is part of the reason they always seem to be fatigued or wanting to sleep. It's kind of like an older person wanting to nap 55,000 times a day because they can't get into those deeper REM levels of sleep. So people that are depressed do suffer from sleep loss. They may be able to sleep, but it's usually because they had crap sleep the night before and the night before that, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, yeah. Usually, I mean, again, you need to have that consistent 8 hours or thereabouts to get into those deeper levels of REM, especially the second half of the 8 hours. All right, bipolar. How do we treat bipolar and other depressive um, mood disorders? Well, for bipolar, antipsychotics, and you may have seen some of these. I would highlight, maybe just know an example or two: Zyprexa, Risperdal, Abilify, Clozaril. All of these are used in the treatment of bipolar disorder. Mood stabilizers can, in some cases, be used in conjunction with antipsychotics. Antipsychotics usually have a stabilizing quality, and they also will help people that suffer from hallucinations or delusions, which we'll get into in just a little bit. Mood stabilizers: Depakote, Epital, lithium. Lithium, which is actually a specific type of salt, highly powerful. Lithium was kind of a game changer in the treatment of mental illness, and we'll talk more about lithium here a little bit later, especially in the treatment of people with schizophrenia and other delusional type psychotic disorders, which we'll talk about. Some other psychopharmaceuticals. Again, psycho meaning it's acting on our psychology, pharmaceutical because it's a drug. Any antidepressant, Prozac, Celexa, Zoloft, Paxil, all of these you can see advertisements for usually. Prozac's kind of an older one. Mood stabilizers I just went over. Antipsychotics, again, all of those. Abilify, Clozaril, et cetera, et cetera. Non-medicinal. There's a lot of non-medicinal treatments available out there. And again, when you go to see a psychiatrist and or a psychologists can prescribe non-medicinal treatments. Psychiatrists have to prescribe the medicines. And oftentimes psychiatrists will work specifically with another psychologist in order to supply the medical needs. Psychotalk, which is basically kind of like free association. ECT, electrocrans, basically they're running magnets and small electric currents through your brain. RTMS, also another type of kind of like a magnetic therapy. Support groups, CBT, family therapy, psychotherapy, and educational interventions all can be effective components to a treatment schedule. Okay, any questions on bipolar depressive disorders? Again, I only covered a couple of them. There are hundreds. Okay, what's schizophrenia? What's schizophrenia? Anybody? Schizophrenia, the word comes from split mind, okay? And oftentimes, some of the key symptoms of schizophrenia, what are they? Hallucinations, good. Hallucinations or delusions. Hallucinations are sensory data that does not exist, meaning you see things that aren't there, or you can hear things that aren't there. And in some odd cases, you can actually feel things that are not there. Delusions, on the other hand, are usually unseen and unobserved, but they're more of like assumptions. Okay, so um, split mind disorder is what it used to be called, but now we call it schizophrenia. Hallucinations, delusions, disordered thinking. Some of the symptoms can actually be something called word salad. This is where people will try to speak to somebody else, but because they have a cognitive interruption, like a split, the words will come out in completely a wrong order. Okay, kind of like when we did semantics. I said the cat fat is the, or something like that. Whatever I said, that would be kind of an example of what word salad might be for a schizophrenic. Um, so, characterized by disorganized thoughts, speech, and perceptions. Delusions. Okay, there is no evidence or agreement to a delusion. Basically, this is an altered reality that is highly persistent. People that suffer from schizophrenia oftentimes will believe in like conspiracies and alien interventions, things that are not probable at all, not documented, but they will cling on to these with almost an obsessive compulsive type behavior. Um, they have problems keeping attention, again, because of the split mind. And again, like I said, word salad. We'll talk about this in just a second. Where do we see a very large, disproportionate number of people that suffer from schizophrenia? This is really sad. Well, yeah, mental institutions, yes, but the homeless population. Write that down. There is a high rate of homeless schizophrenics, especially your more moderate to severe schizophrenics. Can anybody tell me why? This is a common sense question. Okay, it's a little harsh, but okay. They can't function and they can't pay to function. What do you think, Liv? Okay, employment can be very difficult for somebody that suffers from schizophrenia. Oftentimes, people that have mental disorders, guys, they need help from what? Other people. In particular, usually who? Your family, right? Because schizophrenia is such a dissociative type disorder where you have splits from reality. When people are suffering from schizophrenic episodes, it's really, really hard on the family. And a lot of this is really sad, but a lot of times people that suffer from especially moderate to severe schizophrenia will remove themselves from their families willingly. And because they do this, they remove themselves from support, which they probably could benefit from, but they see the effect that their disorder has on their loved ones. And it's hard. Any mental disorder would be a challenge. But schizophrenia, because of the rapid changes in mind and reality, it can really take a toll on the family. So a lot of times people that suffer from schizophrenia will remove themselves and live elsewhere. But because they can't hold down a job, because they have a hard time, intermixing with social society, being homeless is usually what a lot of them end up as a last resort. And unfortunately, because they're homeless, they have an impairment to medical treatment. Okay, it's not easy to get a prescription at Walgreens if you're homeless. Okay, finding a job to pay for those prescriptions or insurance, like all of those things. So what we have seen here in the greater Charleston area is an outreach from local healthcare where they have like mobile crisis centers that will go around to various homeless communities and areas that have high rates of homelessness, and they will try to administer mental health treatment. But again, mental health in the homeless population is disproportionately high in terms of disorders compared to the general pop. Okay, so diminished and inappropriate emotions. This is called the flat effect. Okay, quite common in schizophrenics. Basically, kind of like I don't want to say a zombie, but the way your empathy kind of shuts off. So your understanding of other people's emotions, thoughts, and feelings just kind of goes away. And oftentimes this is a temporary thing, and it will come back. But sometimes with awareness of how you treated the people while you were in the flat effect, or sometimes with no knowledge of that. And again, it depends on the severity of the schizophrenia. Chronic versus acute. Chronic versus acute. Again, chronic means long lasting. Please highlight that. Hopefully, you all know what chronic means by now. Um, if somebody's diagnosed with chronic schizophrenia, there is little chance of full recovery. Now, treatment with medications and therapies can help, but people with chronic schizophrenia, and this can be diagnosed as early as puberty. Usually, we see schizophrenics being diagnosed into their late teens, early 20s, when the disorder becomes much more apparent and more active. People with acute schizophrenia actually can cure themselves or can be cured through treatments and therapies. And sometimes the schizophrenia just ceases to be observable. The symptoms just simply go away. There are documented cases of people that have been diagnosed with schizophrenia that it just fades away. Okay, or sometimes it goes away with medical treatment or therapies. Some of the things that we do see with schizophrenics in terms of the biology, we do see excessive amounts of dopamine. Please make sure you know high levels of dopamine are connected with schizophrenia. Undersupply of dopamine is linked to what? Very good. Parkinson's disorder. If you don't know that, jot that down. High levels of dopamine, I already have that up here. High levels of dopamine or excessive levels of dopamine is associated with schizophrenia. An undersupply of dopamine is Parkinson's disorder or Parkinson's disease. We may see shrinkage in these three areas, the hippocampus, amygdala, and corpus callosum. And again, this really impacts your working memory and your declarative memory. We also see issues with the medial temporal lobe, which is a bit more than what you need to know, and the prefrontal lobe. We also see smaller levels of gray matter, as well as disconnected white matter, meaning that the white matter that does exist does not show a lot of continuity. Remember, the white matter is basically the myelin sheaths of the axons. If you have a properly functioning brain, you should see long stretches of myelinated neurons, okay? In the case of schizophrenics, we oftentimes see disjointed myelin sheathing, meaning that there's a space, and then a space, and then a space, not long connectedness. All right, so some prenatal factors that we do know, prenatal factors or symptoms that do increase the level of developing schizophrenia: low birth weight, oxygen deprivation, mother's a diabetic, and the father is older. Some very odd factors that could happen during birth, but they are linked to higher chances of schizophrenia. Highlight, circle, star, whatever. Flu, while the mother is pregnant, increases the odds of having a schizophrenic child. There are also other viruses that can cause higher rates of schizophrenia. Zika was one of the ones that was causing schizophrenia here a while back. I don't know if Zika is still the thing that it was. You guys remember Zika? The Zika virus? Before Zika, there was the West Nile virus. The West Nile virus caused encephalitis, though, which was swelling in the brain. The Zika virus, though, for pregnant mothers could in some cases result in higher levels of schizophrenia in their children. So again, strong correlation between viral infections. Again, epigenetic effects. This is scarring due to trauma or viral or bacterial exposure. Okay. Basically, what we're seeing is that we think that there's a strong connection between the prenatal environment and schizophrenia. Okay. If there are issues or errors in the prenatal environment, virus, bacteria, oxygen deprivation, whatever, it does increase in your chances of having schizophrenia. Again, more stuff that speaks to the birth environment. In identical twins, if you have one schizophrenic child, the other child has a 50% increased chance to have the same brain abnormalities. It doesn't necessarily mean that they will develop schizophrenic symptoms, but it does mean that they will have shared brain 50% or a 1 in 2 chance of having shared brain abnormalities. If you have the same placenta, meaning that the twin develops in a single placenta sac or placental sac, that 50% then goes up to 60%. Okay, in the odd case that your identical twins actually have a separate placental sac, remember that's a slightly different birth environment. It's only 10%. So strong correlation to birth environment. Okay, fraternal twins, not a super high correlation, slightly elevated risk, but not much. If you have one of the twins having schizophrenia, you only have a 15% chance. All right, onset. Highlight that, please. Onset. Onset is a word that just marks the beginning of a mental disorder. Onset, or the beginning. Okay, the onset of schizophrenia, usually in mid to late puberty, like mid to late teens into the 20s. Okay, possible early warning signs. You're probably not going to need to know all these guys. But again, mother has schizophrenia, birth complications, separation from parents, short attention spans, poor coordination, peer relations, and abuse. Okay. Schizophrenia, on average, has a prevalence rate of 1% or thereabouts, meaning it affects 1% of our population. However, in some areas with the homeless population, it's as high as 20%. So again, make that connection with schizophrenia and just remember why. It makes sense if you think about it. Okay, treatment. Antipsychotics. Again, this is used to treat the delusions, the voices, those sensory images and sounds that aren't there. Thorazine, also, specifically. And again, the non-medicinal, we have CBT support groups, family therapy, psychotherapy, educational interventions. There is no cure for schizophrenia. And guys, in a lot of mental illness, there is no quote-unquote cure. There's only treatment, which means that the disease may or may not persist throughout a lifetime, but if there's no cure that exists, then all you can do is treat the symptoms. Kind of like most viruses. Okay, even with COVID, there is no cure for COVID, only preventative measures. Anybody have any questions? Okay. So, somatic-based disorders, Module 69. Somatic symptom disorder. This is basically where we have extreme physical symptoms. And somatic in this case means physical symptoms. Pain, fatigue. One of those would be fibromyalgia, which you've probably heard about. Again, this is where your somatic nervous system is causing some sort of emotional and physical response in your body. This one is very, very, very rare, conversion disorder. And I actually have a video in my slideshow if you want to go into the slideshow and look at it when you have time. But the conversion disorder causes the inability of a person to be able to use certain parts of their body. There was a story of a young girl from Australia who was playing volleyball. She was like your age, maybe even a little younger. Playing volleyball, and all of a sudden she falls over. Never had any problem up to this. And her legs wouldn't work. Literally couldn't feel her legs. Everybody thinks, oh, yeah, it's got to be some kind of a spinal injury. exams, tests, can't find any problems. Okay, a few days later, half of the side of her face stops to work, like all the muscles lose like kind of like a stroke. Okay, Trenton setup. But ultimately, she finally, after like almost a year, gets diagnosed with what's called conversion disorder, and this is where the body almost kind of turns on itself and is shutting down various parts. Usually the non-essential parts, like not like heart and lungs and that sort of thing, but like appendages, part of your musculoskeletal system. All right, arms just stop to work, and it took her like months to relearn how to walk. It's a very, very rare disease, but I find it very interesting. But it is really it's really odd how it attacks the body. Blindness, paralysis. Usually, there's really no medical explanation other than conversion disorder itself. I mean, it's really hard to diagnose. Illness, anxiety disorder, germaphobes, hypochondriasis. Um, if you've ever met, there are quite a few people that always are I think I have this disorder or this disease. Like, how many of you use WebMD? Come on. Do you like symptom it up? Like, oh, I have this, this, and this, and this. I want to see what I have. No? Well, good, because once you start going down that rabbit hole, it's really terrifying because I feel like WebMD just points you to the deepest, darkest disease that it can dig up. But anyway, um, let's see. Treatment of somatic disorders. There's really no strong medicinal. There are some anti-anxiety meds and antidepressants, but those are usually more geared towards other illnesses. And the only real treatment would be cognitive behavioral therapy. Again, looking at how we think about things and then how we behaviorally react to that. Dissociative disorders. The Faces of Eve. Hang in there, guys. Almost there. The Three Faces of Eve. Okay. Dissociative identity disorder, or DID. All right. DID. Used to be called multiple personality disorder. This dissociation, guys, you need to understand it's when our brain has a break with reality. When we dissociate, we split from reality. Okay. So, if you think about when we talked about, who did the ice bath? Hilgard. When Hilgard did the hypnosis and put the arm in the ice bath, do you guys remember that? It was a while ago that we talked about that. Okay, he called that dissociation, meaning that our brain kind of separates a little bit if you can be hypnotized. Okay, it doesn't mean your brain actually pops out and goes away. It just means your reality splits. In the case of DID, Shirley Mason and Chris Sizemore are two of the most well-documented cases here in the United States. Three Faces of Eve is all about Chris Sizemore. And again, in that movie, she had three personalities. In reality, she had over 22 personalities. Okay? Usually, in both cases, we see trauma being a strong impetus for the creation of a dissociation, kind of the mind's way of protecting itself by splitting apart. Now, it doesn't physically split, but the reality splits. Sometimes this can be temporary. Sometimes this can last an entire lifetime or anywhere in between. There really is no rhyme or reason. But if the trauma can be identified by a therapist, oftentimes then you can start to see limiting of those dissociations or the dissociative splits. Again, kind of an odd disease. And really, therapies are effective, but again, no specific medications to treat the disorder itself, only the symptoms. Questions, comments? All right, guys, personality disorders. I'm going to touch on a few of these. We're going to skip over schizotypal personality. Again, this is where you have a personality disorder that has elements of what we would consider schizophrenic behaviors, delusions, some of those hallucinations. All right, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. You may or may not have a question on your exam about one of these, but narcissistic personality disorder, just for example, again, this is where people will sacrifice any and all around them to make sure that they feel fulfilled and elevated to the point that they feel they should be elevated. Okay. You may have experienced people like this in your life. This is sometimes lumped into antisocial personality disorder. I think recently it was pulled out of antisocial and made its own category um, because of the fact that it's slightly different than a true like psychopathic behavior or sociopathic behavior. Um, Narcissistic rage, I would highlight that. Narcissistic rage. People that suffer from narcissism are much more likely to experience narcissistic rage. If they don't get what they want out of the people around them, or they don't get fulfilled in terms of they don't see themselves where they think they ought to be, that can happen in these people. Okay. Again, this is a behavioral or personality disorder. Um, Borderline personality disorder. Again, this is a disorder that oftentimes, if you think about like acceptable, not acceptable, these people, and the way I like to think about this disorder is like somebody that kind of goes back and forth between what they think about other people and themselves. Sometimes it's acceptable, sometimes it's unacceptable, and it's a bounce back between those two lines. Again, a fairly rare disorder, but more common than some of your other personality disorders. Antisocial personality disorder, guys. This is where you have your psychopaths, your sociopaths. Now, if you ask 10 different people what's the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath, you'll probably get 10 different answers. Some psychologists say that there really is no difference. Some say that there's a huge difference. Psychopaths, in my interpretation, are people that don't have the moral compass to understand what they're doing is wrong. Sociopaths, like guys like Ted Bundy, highly intelligent usually, but they lack empathy for other people. They understand what right and wrong should be, but they lack the empathy to feel what wrong is or what right is. Highly manipulative, can be highly deadly too. And again, you probably won't be asked about psychopaths versus sociopaths, but when you think of antisocial personality disorder, think of those two and it'll help you remember. Not socially acceptable behaviors, okay? Psychopaths and sociopaths. Any questions on any of these three? Okay. All right, moving on. Cluster B, psychopaths, blah, blah, blah. All right, so let's look at some of the biological factors here. Strong correlation, I would highlight here, especially when it comes to antisocial personality. If you have a brother or a sister, whether you're fraternal, identical, if you have a family member or brother or sister that has either psychopathic or sociopathic behaviors, you are much more likely to display or have that tendency. Frontal lobe. The frontal lobes, which is where our impulse control lies, do not function the same as a normal human being. Again, lack of empathy, okay? Lack of caring about others or being able to feel what others feel. Heart rate, respiration. When people that are psychopathic or sociopathic are exposed to stress, fear, their reactions are usually muted. Like most of us, if we committed a severe crime, like say we murdered somebody, okay, we would have internal conflict about that. People that suffer from anti-personality disorder usually don't suffer the same levels of fear, apprehension, regret, guilt that a normal human being would. Does that make sense? Okay. Cluster C. Cluster C. Avoidant personality disorder. Again, this is where people oftentimes will pull themselves away from social interaction. All right, due to fear of social acceptance, due to being made to look like a fool. And again, the avoidant personality disorder is usually connected to Alfred Adler's inferiority complex. they feel inferior to be able to intermix with other people. And oftentimes, this behavior is incredibly self fulfilling, meaning the less you're around people, the more you want to be alone. So when you start to avoid people, you actually will become more and more unwilling to go out socially. In fact, sometimes these people will avoid interaction altogether, including their families. Okay, again, treatments, same as pretty much every other mental disorder. We have prescriptions of antidepressants, anti-anxieties, mood stabilizers, or antipsychotic drugs, as well as therapies and family and group therapy, or CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. All right, folks. What I'm going to do, we still have to cover the treatments. We have a little bit more here. I've actually kind of interwoven the treatments and well, at least some of the treatments. But I'm going to finish this up, the last couple pages. I'm going to record that, all right, and I will put that on Canvas. So between now and Wednesday, can you all please take your packets and go through that video and finish up the rest of 8. Wednesday, we're going to do 9. Friday is our one and only review day. Test on Tuesday. I'm sorry we don't have more review time, but it is what it is. We will be through the material. Please, between now and Wednesday, sooner the better, add topics to that review Jamboard, okay? Please, I want to answer as many questions as I can, but that requires you guys to add questions to the Jamboard. It's at the bottom of modules. You've also got progress checks through AP Classroom if you want or need more practice. We have a full exam on, a practice exam on AP Classroom as well if you want more practice. Ultimately, hey, one last thing. As we approach your exam, guys, you need to taper down your studying to try to lessen some of that anxiousness, okay? By the time you get to the night before, you should only be spending maybe 15, 20 minutes. Just touch on those things you feel you need to reiterate. Any questions for me? Anybody? Anybody? All right, that's it.